He was 26 and caught in a whiteout. No partner on the rope, no one who knew exactly where he was, no clear line of retreat off the glacier. Just a deep red Gore-Tex shell that his late grandfather had bought him at the age of 19 and that had survived 7 seasons of ice climbing in Lapland and the Norwegian Lofoten. An ice axe held in his right hand. A dark gray 40-liter technical pack with a blue and white climbing rope coiled at the hip, and a folded laminated route map of the Stubai Alps he had bought at a small mountaineering shop in Innsbruck the morning before. And with that gear he had set out alone in the early dawn from a small alpine refuge above the village of Neustift im Stubaital to climb to the upper plateau of the Tiefen Glacier, an unmarked horseshoe of glacial ice at 2,950 meters on the eastern shoulder of an unnamed Stubai peak in the Tyrolean Alps of western Austria. A glacier that had been retreating since the 1980s, and that had been declared off-route to commercial guides in 2013 because of unpredictable crevassing. The forecast at the Innsbruck Weather Service had said clear weather until early evening. The forecast had been wrong. The whiteout had come up out of the south at 11:30 in the morning and had collapsed visibility to perhaps 15 meters in under 4 minutes. He had not been able to see the rope around his own waist. He had stopped where he had stopped because he had been unable to see another step. He had stood for a long minute in the silence of the storm and had listened to the small dry whisper of the snow against the hood of his shell. And then he had taken one careful step forward to test the firmness of the snow, and the snow under his right foot had given way, and he had fallen. The crevasse he had fallen into had been hidden under a thin snow bridge that the storm had built that morning, and that the storm had then concealed. He had dropped about 12 meters before he had landed on a small ledge of compacted snow and ice that had built up by drift along the eastern wall. He had hit hard. He had broken nothing. He had lain on the ledge for perhaps 30 seconds in the cold blue twilight of the ice with his pack against the wall behind him, and his eyes wide and his breath coming faster than he could catch it, before his climbing brain had taken over and had begun to do the small, careful inventory it had been trained to do. The crevasse was perhaps 3 meters wide at the surface and about 2 meters wide at the ledge level. The walls were a deep, cold blue, with thin horizontal seams of compressed snow visible at intervals. Above him, the rectangular slot of the surface opening glowed pale white with the diffused light of the storm. Beyond the ledge, the crevasse dropped on into shadow. He could not see how deep. He had survived. He had broken nothing. He had perhaps 4 hours before the cold of the ice against him would begin to do the work that the fall had not done. But what nobody knew was that frozen in the deep blue ice of the eastern wall of the crevasse, 2 meters above the ledge where he had landed, was a small dark wooden case wrapped in brown waxed oilcloth that had been waiting in the ice since January of 1944, and that what was inside the case would change the life of a 26-year-old Finnish climber and of a 99-year-old Bavarian woman who had been waiting for 80 years to know what had happened to the man she had been engaged to in the autumn of her 19th year. Before we continue, if these stories of climbers and forgotten places matter to you, hit subscribe so the next one finds you. We're climbing into a glacier crevasse in the Austrian Alps that the mountain has been holding closed for over 80 years. And what was frozen below has been waiting for almost as long as the people it was written for have been alive. Henrik Alto had been 26 years old for 10 months. He had been alone in the Alps for 2 weeks. He had taken a leave of absence in late November of the previous year from a junior architectural position at a small firm in Helsinki, where he had been a contract draftsman for 19 months and where he had quietly understood sometime during the autumn that the work he had been doing was not the work he had imagined doing when he had finished his degree. The firm had specialized in office interiors. He had spent his 19 months drawing variations on the same set of meeting room furniture layouts for clients in the Finnish public sector who had not been particularly interested in what they were buying. The firm had given him a generous severance because they had liked him personally. He had taken the severance and the savings he had been keeping in a fixed-term account since his student years, and had bought a one-way flight to Munich and a 6-month-old Toyota Hilux from a used dealer in Garmisch, and a winter ice climbing course at the Innsbruck Bergsteiger Schule. He had completed the course at the end of January. He had spent the last fortnight of February climbing minor ice routes in the Stubai Range with a partner he had met at the school, a Czech man named Pavel, who had been a competent climber and a careful belayer, and who had then been called home to Brno on the 2nd of March, because his father had had a small stroke. Pavel had taken the train south the same evening. Henrik had been left with a refuge bunk that was paid through the end of the week and with a route plan that had been written for 2 ropes, and with the careful finish habit of finishing things he had started. He had decided, on the small wooden bench outside the refuge that night, that he would climb the Tiefin Glacier route alone if the weather held. The route was not technically severe. He had been over similar ground in Lapland a dozen times. He had been on a glacier as recently as the previous Tuesday. He had checked the forecast 3 times. He had checked his harness and his ice screws and his rope and his food. He had told the refuge keeper, an older Tyrolean man named Stefan, who had been running the refuge for 31 years, exactly which route he was taking and what time he was expected back. He had not told his mother in Helsinki where he was. He had not told his older sister. He had told one friend, a fellow architect in Helsinki named Eero, only because he had needed someone to forward his post. He had told his mother and his sister, in a series of careful phone calls in late November and early December, that he had been promoted to a senior draftsman position and that the new role required a 6-month rotation at a partner office in Vienna. The lie had cost him something he had not expected. He had been thinking about the lie at intervals for the entire 3 months he had been in the Alps. He had been thinking about it on the morning of the Whiteout. He had been thinking about whether the work he was not doing in Helsinki was the same as the work he was not yet doing somewhere else. He had set out from the refuge in the early dawn on a Friday morning in early March. The sky to the south had been the hard, cold, pale blue that the Stubai Range had at that altitude in late winter. The first 3 hours of the trail had been routine. The path climbed steadily through the upper alpine meadow above the refuge and emerged onto the lower edge of the glacier at about 9 in the morning. He had roped up to a small rock anchor at the glacier edge and had started across the lower plateau on a route that the previous summer's parties had marked with small wands of red bamboo. The wands had been most of the way intact. He had been making good time. He had been thinking, as he had walked, about the Norwegian climbing trip he had begun to plan in November when he had first taken the leave of absence, a 6-week traverse of the Lingen Alps in late summer that he had not yet committed to, and that he had been thinking about because it had been the kind of trip his late grandfather would have wanted to do with him if he had been alive. His grandfather, Jakob Aalto, had been an alpine guide in Finnish Lapland for 40 years. Jakob had emigrated to Switzerland in his 30s and had served briefly as an instructor at a guide school near Zermatt in the early 70s. Jakob had died in 2017 at the age of 84. The deep red Gore-Tex shell Henrik had been wearing on the morning of the Whiteout had been Jakob's last gift to him, given on the morning of Henrik's 19th birthday in a small house outside Rovaniemi 6 months before Jakob had died. Jakob had said, handing the new jacket to Henrik that morning, that the jacket was a tool and that a tool was as good as the hands that used it. Henrik had been thinking about the jacket and about Jakob and about the work he was not doing in Helsinki, and about the work he wanted to be doing somewhere he had not yet decided when the wind had shifted at 11:30 in the morning and the Whiteout had come in from the south. The first snowflakes had been small and dry. The second wave had been wet and heavy and had begun to settle. By 12 minutes past the hour, the visibility had collapsed, and Henrik had stopped where he was standing. He had stood for 60 seconds on the snow with the rope tight at his harness and the wand he had last passed perhaps 12 meters behind him and had listened. There had been no sound from the world except the small, dry whisper of the snow against the hood of his shell. He had taken one step forward to test the firmness of the snow ahead of him. The snow had given way. He had fallen. He had landed on the ice ledge of the crevasse 12 meters below the surface at perhaps 11:30 in the morning. He had lain still for 30 seconds. He had then sat up slowly against the eastern wall of the crevasse and had begun to take stock. His helmet had cracked at the lower rim, but had held. His left wrist had hurt where he had caught his weight. He had moved the fingers, and the wrist had held. His ice axe was still tethered to his right wrist by its leash. The pack was on his back. The rope was still attached to his harness. He had craned his head up to follow the rope's catenary and had seen that the rope ran out of the crevasse and had pulled, evidently against the snow at the edge of the bridge as he had fallen, and had then snagged on something at the surface that had stopped his fall short of where it might have gone. He had sat for some minutes with his back against the cold wall and had let his breathing slow. He had then turned on the small headlamp clipped to the front of his cracked helmet. The yellow beam had cut through the cold blue of the ice and had revealed the small geography of the ledge he had landed on. The ledge was perhaps 1.5 meters wide and 3 meters long. Beneath the ledge, the crevasse dropped on into shadow that the headlamp did not reach. The walls of the crevasse rose vertically on both sides into the rectangular pale rectangle of the surface opening above. The eastern wall, which was the wall directly behind him, was a deep blue mass of compressed glacial ice. He had begun to do the things a trapped climber does when he has time. He had clipped his pack to a small ice screw he had set into the ice of the wall behind him. He had unrolled the small emergency bivouac sheet he carried in the lid of the pack and had wrapped it around his shoulders. He had shouted up the crevasse 3 times at intervals of 1 minute and had received no answer. He had checked his phone, which he had known would be useless this deep in the ice, and had confirmed that he had no signal. He had sent a delayed pre-written distress message to the refuge keeper through his satellite messenger. The messenger sent on a 4-hour interval, and the next send window was at 3 in the afternoon. He had then turned his head to the left to look more carefully at the eastern wall of the crevasse, and the beam of his headlamp had moved across the wall and had stopped. There had been a shape in the ice. The shape had been small and dark and rectangular. It had been embedded in the deep blue ice, perhaps 2 meters above his ledge, and perhaps an arm's length to the left of where he was sitting. The headlamp had lit it from below at an angle that had picked out one rounded corner and the suggestion of a flat lid. Henrik had stared at the shape for a long minute. Then he had taken his ice axe and had stood up carefully against the wall and had reached up to test the ice around the shape. The ice around the shape had been softer than the ice elsewhere on the wall. It had been thawed and refrozen, the way the ice at the surface of a glacier was thawed and refrozen by every summer's melt. He had worked with the axe for perhaps 40 minutes. He had chipped the ice away from the rounded corners of the shape and had freed first one side and then the other. The shape had then come away from the wall with a small dry release that had felt, in the cold of the crevasse, like the opening of a door he had not known was there. The shape had been a small dark wooden case wrapped in brown waxed oilcloth. The wood of the case was dark-stained pine. The oilcloth had cracked in several places where the case had been pressing against the ice, but had held its shape. The case was about 30 centimeters long and 20 wide and 10 deep. There had been a small brass clasp on the front of the case under the oilcloth. He had carried the case back to where the bivouac sheet was and had sat down with it across his thighs and had unwrapped the oilcloth carefully. The case had been intact. The clasp had been stiff, but had given when he had pressed the small thumb lever. The lid had opened with a small dry sound. There had been 4 things inside the case, layered against each other on a folded square of brown wool that had been laid in the bottom of the case to pad its contents. The top item had been a small Wehrmacht-issue leather wallet stamped with a small black eagle, and the date, 1942. He had opened the wallet. Inside had been a Soldbuch military paybook in the name of Karl Reinhold, born Garmisch-Partenkirchen, 1919, of the 1st Gebirgsjäger Division of the German Wehrmacht Alpine Troops. The Soldbuch had been issued in November 1941 and had been stamped with the dates of his postings. The last stamp had been dated 14th January 1944, Stubaital. Behind the Soldbuch had been a hand-tinted black-and-white photograph of a young woman in a pale dress sitting on a stone wall in front of an Austrian Alpine farmhouse. She had been perhaps 18 or 19 years old. The photograph had been signed in pencil along the lower margin. Für Karl von deiner Liesel, Hofstetten, August 1942. The second item in the case had been a stack of 23 folded letters tied with brown twine. The letters, written on small folded sheets of cream paper, each addressed in pencil in the same careful hand to Liesel Hofer, Hofstetten, bei Tolz, Bayern. Some of the letters had stamps that had been postmarked. Some had stamps that had not. Some had no stamps at all. The third item had been a small folded map of the Stubai-Italian border passes, hand-marked with small penciled crosses at 3 positions along a ridgeline. The fourth item, sitting at the bottom of the case under everything else, had been a single sealed envelope. The envelope had been addressed in the same careful penciled hand. The address read, Liesel, mein Liebes, eröffnen, wenn ich nicht zurückkomme. Liesel, my dearest, open if I do not come back. Henrik had sat in the cold blue twilight of the crevasse with the envelope in his cold hands and had not moved for a long time. He had thought, sitting on the cold ledge with the envelope between his fingers, about the woman in the hand-tinted photograph. She had been perhaps 18 or 19 in the picture. The dress had been pale blue or pale yellow. The hand-tinting made it difficult to be sure. Her hair had been pinned up the way young women had pinned their hair up in the early 40s. She had been smiling slightly, the kind of smile a young woman gives a camera that her fiancé is operating. The wall she had been sitting on had been the limestone wall of an Austrian alpine farmhouse. He had thought about her for a long time, sitting on the ledge in the cold, with his shoulders against the ice, and the letter she had never read in his cold hand. He had thought about what it would have been like to be her in February of 1944. He had thought about what it would be like to be her now, if she were still alive. He had thought about the kind of waiting that takes up most of a long life. And then he had thought very carefully about the sealed envelope, and about whether he had any right to carry it down off the mountain at all, and about what he would do if he got the chance. He had decided, sitting on the ice ledge in the cold, that he would carry it down if he could, and that he would find her, if she were findable, and that he would put it into her hands. The mountain rescue had come for him at 5:15 in the afternoon, in clear weather under a setting sun, after the refugee keeper had received his 3 p.m. distress message and had called the regional rescue service in Innsbruck. The rescue had been straightforward. 2 climbers had rappelled to the ledge, had assessed his condition, had warmed him on the ledge for 15 minutes, and had hauled him up to the surface in a rescue litter. He had been able to walk by the time he had reached the refuge. He had spent that night at the refuge under 3 wool blankets with a strong tea and a careful inspection by a regional doctor who had determined that he had no serious injuries and that the cracked helmet had done its job. He had not told the rescue team about the wooden case. He had not been able to explain to himself at first why he had not. He had wrapped the case in his fleece jacket inside the pack against his back and had told no one. The next morning he had taken the bus from Neustift down to Innsbruck and had walked to the small Austrian Alpine Museum on the Herzog Friedrichstrasse in the Old Town. He had asked, at the museum's reception, whether anyone there could help him identify a 1944 Wehrmacht Alpine Troops paybook. A woman at the reception had asked him to wait and had then brought down a man named Dr. Stefan Wegner from an upper office. Dr. Wegner had been the museum's senior historian for the Alpine Warfare collection. He had been 65 years old. He had been the kind of careful Austrian historian who had spent his career documenting the difficult parts of his country's past, and who had stopped flinching long ago at the small artifacts that came up out of the glaciers as the glaciers retreated. Henrik had set the case on a polished wooden table in a small back room of the museum. He had opened the case. He had laid out the wallet, the photograph, the bundle of letters, the map, and the sealed envelope on the wool that had lined the bottom of the case. Dr. Wegner had not touched anything for a long time. He had stood at the table with his hands clasped behind his back and had read the Soldbuch from across the table. He had then asked Henrik whether he had read the letters. Henrik had said no. Dr. Wegner had said that he would help. He had spent the next 2 hours with Henrik in the small room, reading the postmarks on the letters, checking the names against the museum's database, comparing the Soldbuch's last stamp to the regimental records of the 1st Gebirgsjäger Division. The records confirmed that Karl Reinhold, born Garmisch-Partenkirchen, 1919, had disappeared on a routine patrol on the Upper Tiefenglacier on the morning of the 17th of January 1944 in a sudden whiteout. His body had not been recovered. The case had closed in 1947 in the official register. His fiancée, Liesel Hofer of Hofstetten by Bad Tölz, had been listed in the regimental file as next of kin. Dr. Wegner had then taken Henrik to the museum's small genealogical research room and had used the Bavarian Civil Registry to confirm that Liesel Hofer had been born in 1925 in Hofstetten and that she had never married. She was 99 years old. She was alive. She lived in the same village she had been born in a small Bavarian timber-framed cottage at the edge of the village south of Munich, in the care of a great-niece named Magdalena Reiter, who was 54. Dr. Wegner had given Henrik the address. Dr. Wegner had said in his careful low voice that he had been waiting for 30 years for one of these Glacier finds to come back to a living relative. He had said that he would call ahead so that the visit was not a shock. They had spoken for about 20 minutes. Then Dr. Wegner had asked Henrik whether he wanted to do this, and Henrik had said yes. Henrik had driven the Hilux from Innsbruck to Hofstetten the following morning. The drive took 5 hours. He had brought the case with him. He had brought the letters in the order he had found them. He had brought the sealed envelope in the inside pocket of his shell jacket against his chest. Hofstetten was a small Bavarian village on the Isar, 15 kilometers south of Bad Tölz, with one pub and one church and one grocer's. The cottage at the edge of the village was the cottage Liesel Hofer had been born in. The wooden gate had a small painted sign with the family name in faded blue paint. Magdalena Reiter had opened the door. She had been waiting for him. She had not said much. She had led him into a small front parlor where a wood stove was burning low and where a clean wooden table stood by a window, letting in soft Bavarian morning light. A very small old woman had been sitting in a wooden chair at the table. She had been wearing a soft dark gray cardigan over a cream blouse, and her thin white hair had been pulled back into a small low bun. Her eyes had been faded blue and very alive. She had looked at Henrik for a long second when he had come into the room, and she had not said anything. Henrik had set the wooden case on the table. He had sat down across from her. He had taken the wallet out of the case first and had placed it on the table. He had taken the bundle of 23 letters tied with brown twine and had laid it next to the wallet. He had taken the hand-tinted photograph of her younger self in the pale dress and had laid it on top of the bundle. And then he had taken the sealed envelope out of the inside pocket of his shell jacket and had laid it on the table in front of her. She had looked at the envelope for a long time. Her hands had stayed in her lap. After perhaps a minute, she had reached out very slowly with her right hand and had picked up the envelope. She had turned it over and had read the address on the front and had read the address on the back. Then she had looked at Henrik. She had said in soft Bavarian accented German the first words she had said since he had come into the room. She had said, "Du hast ihn gefunden." You found him. Henrik had nodded. He had not been able to speak for a long second. Liesel had then pressed the wax seal of the envelope against her lips for a moment, the way an old woman touches a thing that is about to bring back the part of her life she had been waiting 80 years for. Then she had cracked the seal under her thumb and had unfolded the letter. She had read it slowly, with a small magnifying glass that Magdalena had handed her. The letter had been short. It had been written on the morning of the 16th of January 1944, the day before Karl had walked out onto the glacier and had not come back. It had been a marriage proposal. It had been the proposal he had not been able to say to her in the months before he had been called to his last posting. It had asked her to marry him in the spring if he came home. It had ended with the line, "Wenn ich nicht zurückkomme, mein Liebes, dann warte nicht. Lebe für uns beide. If I do not come back, my dearest, do not wait. Live for us both." Liesel had read the letter twice. She had then folded it carefully and had laid it on the table in front of her. She had sat with her hands in her lap for a long minute. Magdalena had been weeping quietly at the wood stove. Liesel had then said, very quietly, that she was glad he had asked her, even after all these years. She had said that she had spent 80 years not knowing what he had been carrying with him on that morning. She had said that she had not married because she had not wanted to marry anyone but Carl, and that she did not regret that, and that she was tired, but that she was glad. She had looked at Henrik again then, and had said, in the same soft voice, "You came a long way to bring this." Magdalena had brought a fresh pot of tea from the kitchen. She had set the tray on the table and had refilled the small white cups for all three of them. She had sat down beside her great-aunt with a hand on the very old woman's shoulder. The very old woman had drunk her tea slowly. After a long, quiet minute she had begun, in the same soft Bavarian voice, to talk. She had told Henrik about Carl. She had told him about the summer of 1942 when they had met at a village dance in Hofstetten, and about the small letters Carl had begun to send her from his Alpine training postings, and about the long winter of 1943 when his unit had been moved to the Stubai sector. She had told Henrik about the morning of the 17th of January 1944 when she had not received the letter she had been expecting, and about the fortnight after when she had received no letter at all, and about the day in February when the regimental notification had come to her parents' house in Hofstetten with a small printed form letter and an empty space where the next of kin's response was meant to go. She had told Henrik about her parents who had died in the late 50s, and about the small house she had inherited from them, and about the 3 offers of marriage she had declined in her early 30s from men who had come back from the war with their own losses to carry. She had told him about the village school where she had taught primary children for 38 years before her retirement. She had told him about the particular small habit she had developed in her late 40s of walking out into the village square on the 17th of January every year and lighting a candle at the parish church and sitting alone in the back pew for an hour. She had not stopped doing it, she said, even after the priest had changed twice in the years since. Henrik had stayed for 2 more hours. Liesel had asked him about Finland and about ice climbing and about his late grandfather, and Henrik had answered her questions in the careful Finnish-accented German he had learned at the Innsbruck school. He had not told her about his job or his architecture or his uncertainty. He had told her about Lapland and about Jacob and about the deep red shell jacket. Liesel had nodded slowly when he had described the jacket. She had said, at the end, "A good tool stays in the family." The case and the letters and the photograph stayed with Liesel. The sealed envelope she had asked Magdalena to keep in a small wooden box in the upper drawer of the front cabinet for as long as Liesel was alive, and then to give to the parish priest at Hofstetten. The Soldbuch and the small folded map of the Stubai Italian border passes went, with Liesel's permission, to the Alpine Warfare collection at the Innsbruck Museum, where Dr. Wegner had begun the slow, careful work of cataloging the patrol that had been lost on the 17th of January 1944, and the soldier whose remains had still not been recovered. Henrik did not stay in Bavaria more than a day. He drove the Hilux back to Innsbruck the following morning. He returned to Helsinki at the end of March. He did not go back to the architectural firm. He enrolled in the spring intake at the Norwegian Mountain Guide School in Tromsø in early April. The Lingen Alps traverse he had been thinking about on the morning of the Whiteout he completed in the late summer of the same year. Alone, in the slow, careful pace his grandfather Jacob had taught him, with the deep red shell jacket on his shoulders and a small black and white photograph of an old woman in Bavaria zipped into the inside pocket against his chest.